Think for a moment about what happens to the human psyche when the explosive, passionate fire of Mars is just completely trapped by the icy, rigid discipline of Saturn.
Right. It's a profound friction.
Exactly. It creates this psychological landscape that is defined by intense, almost agonizing tension. It's a mind forged entirely between the desperate, burning urge to conquer the world and the heavy, unyielding reality of being forced to wait. And as we sit here today, listening to the quiet clinking of these ceramic mugs and that low, steady hum of the rain outside the windows of Cafe Karma, it really feels like the perfect atmosphere to unpack this deeply contemplative state.
It really is a beautiful backdrop for this.
Yeah. So if you are listening to this deep dive right now, I want you to think about the people in your own life. Have you ever noticed how some individuals possess this immaculate, almost supernatural sense of timing in their public or professional lives, yet they harbor this intense, isolating turbulence in their private emotional worlds?
I mean, what is so fascinating about that observation is that you are describing the precise earthly manifestation of the Dhanishta Nakshatra. That tension you just mentioned, the flawless external rhythm masking deep internal friction, that is the core challenge of this specific astrological energy.
The core challenge.
Yeah, it is the lifelong struggle between maintaining a receptive, spiritually empty state, what we might call a hollow reed, versus succumbing to the immense gravity of a heavy, worldly ego.
A hollow reed. That makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider that in the ancient texts, Dhanishta's primary symbol is a musical drum.
Right.
Like the damaru, that two-sided drum held by Shiva.
Exactly, the damaru. And the fundamental nature of a drum is that it only works, it only creates resonating music because it is entirely empty inside.
Right. If it's stuffed full of things, it just makes a dull thud.
Exactly. Psychologically, this drum nature gifts individuals with strong Dhanishta placements an unparalleled sense of rhythm and timing. It makes them highly adaptable to their environments. Because they naturally possess that inner hollowness, that capacity to be a vessel, they can essentially tune in to the frequency of any room they enter.
They just absorb it.
Yes. They walk into a boardroom or like a social gathering, they listen, they absorb the ambient rhythm of the people around them, and then they play it back perfectly. They instinctively know exactly when to act, when to speak, and perhaps most importantly, when to hold back.
I do want to contextualize that, though, because perfect rhythm doesn't just happen peacefully. It's not a passive trait.
No, not at all.
It comes directly from that intense Mars-Saturn dynamic we opened with. If we look for an everyday comparison, think of a high-performance car engine.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Right. Because the explosive, violent combustion of the fuel inside the cylinders represents the sheer force of Mars. But that explosion is entirely contained, directed, and regulated by the cold, heavy, restrictive steel of the engine block, which is Saturn.
Exactly.
If the timing of those valves, opening and closing, is even a fraction of a millisecond off, that internal fire will cause the engine to literally tear itself apart. But when it's perfectly synchronized, when the restriction flawlessly manages the explosion, it drives tremendous, unstoppable forward momentum.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the internal reality of this placement. The mind is a contained explosion. And if we connect this to the broader trajectory of a person's life, that perfect internal synchronization explains their career paths.
How so?
Well, because rhythm, timing, and structural organization are their absolute superpowers, they naturally gravitate toward and excel in fields where timing is paramount. So we see this heavily in musicians, dancers, and athletes, where physical rhythm and the precise firing of muscles are everything.
The athlete connection is incredibly logical. Sports are rarely just about raw strength. They're entirely about immaculate timing. The split-second decision to swing a bat, the precise moment to jump for a rebound, or just the exact cadence of a runner's breathing. It is all applied rhythm.
Precisely. But this dynamic also translates into highly structured, high-stakes professions that you might not immediately associate with the musical drum. You find this energy strongly represented in real estate managers, for instance.
Oh, really? Real estate?
Yes, because they must understand the cyclical rhythms of the market perfectly to buy and sell at the right moment. You also see it heavily in military personnel and surgeons,
because of the precision.
Exactly. In an operating room, immaculate timing and precision are quite literally a matter of life or death. The surgeon's scalpel requires the bold courage and decisiveness of Mars to make the cut, but it demands the steady, unflinching, heavily practiced hand of Saturn to ensure the cut is perfectly measured.
Wow. Okay, so if a surgeon or an elite athlete relies on this intense internal synchronization, it implies a certain level of fierce independence. The engine runs on its own tightly calibrated internal timing, but humans don't exist in a vacuum. So what happens when another person, with their own messy, unpredictable rhythm enters the equation? How does this highly structured energy behave in intimate relationships?
This raises the most difficult aspect of this placement, actually, and it brings us directly to the shadow side of Dhanishta.
The darker earthly manifestations.
Right. When that immense disciplined drive for success and material mastery loses its spiritual hollowness, when the individual forgets to be the empty drum and instead fills themselves with self-importance, the energy curls.
It turns toxic.
Very much so. It can manifest as a very strong materialistic bent, a ruthless pursuit of status, and even clinical narcissism. And because of that intense ongoing friction between the aggressive nature of Mars and the cold boundaries of Saturn, they are highly prone to severe marital discord.
Which tracks with the source text, right? Because they mentioned that Dhanishta's animal symbol is the lioness, which to me implies a fierce, almost territorial independence. A lioness is protective, she's a primary hunter, and she operates with this sense of solitary royalty even when she's surrounded by a pride. She doesn't compromise her nature for the sake of the group.
Yes, the lioness perfectly encapsulates that aggressive, commanding, and fundamentally self-sufficient presence. But to truly understand the relationship dynamic, we have to look deeper into the presiding deities of this nakshatra. It is ruled by the 8 Vasus, which are elemental deities, and specifically the mythology points to the sky Vasu, who was cursed to live out a human life on Earth.
Right, the story of Bhishma from the Mahabharata. For those who might not be familiar with the epic, he's one of the most revered and tragic figures in the text.
Exactly. Bhishma lived an entire human lifetime under a strict, unyielding vow of lifelong celibacy. It was essentially a forced bachelorhood. He was fiercely loyal to his kingdom, entirely unmatched in battle, highly respected by everyone, but utterly denied romantic or emotional fulfillment.
So that plays into the psychology today.
It does. This ancient myth serves as the foundational psychological blueprint for Dhanishta's earthly struggles with intimacy. The nature of this energy is highly practical, highly functional, and extremely dutiful. It's focused on duty and achievement. It is rarely emotional, and it is almost never inherently romantic.
I mean, I have to say, having a fierce, solitary lioness as your romance symbol and a vow of eternal celibacy as your foundational myth isn't exactly a recipe for a fairy tale wedding.
No, it certainly is not. And that is why we see such a statistically high rate of partnership difficulties here. The native often attracts partners who are vastly different from them, leading to inevitable clashes of rhythm. The uncompromising, boundary-setting nature of Saturn, combined with the combative, easily irritated nature of Mars, makes it profoundly difficult to yield to another person.
Because yielding requires a softening. It requires dropping your armor and allowing someone else's rhythm to alter your own.
Precisely. Dhanishta instinctively resists that softening because their entire success is built on maintaining their own rigid internal timing.
But this fierce, independent, rhythmic energy isn't just one monolithic personality type, is it? Depending on exactly where this nakshatra falls in the zodiac, this energy fractures into 4 distinct psychological structures, which the texts call pares, or quarters.
It does, yes. The nakshatra bridges the latter half of the sign of Capricorn and the first half of Aquarius. So its 4 quarters each take on a uniquely different psychological flavor depending on the sub-ruling planets of those specific degrees.
Before we break down the behavioral realities of those 4 quarters, let's look at a second everyday comparison to understand that Mars-Saturn dynamic, because the way these planets interact shifts depending on the quarter.
Okay.
Think of a blacksmith forging a sword. The passionate, aggressive heat of the forge is Mars. It makes the iron hot and malleable. But it is the cold, heavy, repetitive, unyielding hammering of the anvil Saturn that actually gives the blade its deadly edge and purpose.
That is a very apt, highly visual comparison.
Yeah, because the heat without the hammer is just a glowing, useless puddle of metal. The hammer without the heat just shatters the cold steel. They absolutely need each other to create the weapon.
Exactly. So let us look at how this forged blade manifests across the 4 padas in a person's daily life. The first quarter falls in the subdivision of Leo, which is ruled by the sun. Here, the psychological focus is squarely on aggressive achievement.
So the ego applies its inner, heavily disciplined self to conquer the outer world.
Right. It looks like intense, unwavering pride. It manifests as a person who is heavily oriented toward career and status. Think of the executive who demands flawless execution from their team, who treats the boardroom like a battlefield to be conquered.
They want to lead the charge?
Yes, they are charismatic, but their rhythm is dominant and authoritative. They want to be the lead drum in the orchestra, and they expect everyone else to fall in line with their tempo.
That sounds exhausting to maintain. So how does that blunt force change when it crosses into the second quarter? Because that shifts into Virgo territory, governed by Mercury. Mercury is highly analytical, communicative, and notoriously restless.
It is.
Taking that heavy blacksmith's hammer and applying it to a restless mind must create a very different behavioral pattern.
It creates a fascinating shift. In the Virgo quarter, the focus pivots to musical strategy and technical skill. It is a highly calculative, adaptable psyche. The heavy, sweeping hammering of Saturn becomes very precise, almost microscopic here. Yeah, this is where you see unparalleled hand-eye coordination. It produces the strategic athlete who wins not by brute force, but by outthinking the opponent, or the anxious perfectionist musician who will practice a single scale for 10 hours until it is mathematically flawless.
But as you noted, Mercury's mutable, constantly shifting nature doesn't exactly help with that marital stability we discussed earlier.
No, it makes the mind constantly seek new rhythms, which can be deeply unsettling for a partner.
If Mercury makes them restless and anxious, what happens when this heavy forge crosses into the third quarter? Because now we are moving into the sign of Aquarius. But the subdivision is influenced by Libra, which is ruled by Venus. Venus usually softens things, smoothing out the rough edges. I imagine that intense psychological friction finally gives a moment of relief.
Yes, and here the focus softens considerably. The relentless drive for conquest turns outward toward harmony, art, and group orientation. This quarter seeks social wealth rather than just material dominance.
That's a nice change of pace.
It is by far the most amicable, optimistic, and musical part of Dhanishta. You might see this manifest as a community organizer, a socialite, or an ensemble musician who uses their inherent sense of rhythm to build networks and bring disparate groups of people together.
So they're actually working with others.
Exactly. Because the diplomatic nature of Venus softens that harsh Mars-Saturn edge. This is the one specific area within the nakshatra where marital harmony actually has a fighting chance. They are willing to adjust their internal tempo to match their partner.
That is a beautiful reprieve, but it's short-lived, right?
Yeah.
Because the energy ends in the fourth quarter, which falls under the influence of Scorpio. And Scorpio is ruled by Mars. So you're taking this already aggressive Mars-Saturn sword and you're dropping it into deep emotional waters ruled by Mars itself. What happens when you double that Martian energy?
The focus becomes what the texts describe as the scientific warrior. It is an intense, highly esoteric, and deeply athletic drive fueled by raw, concentrated Martian energy. The rhythm here is heavy, pounding, and relentless, like war drums. In daily life, this manifests as the relentless researcher probing the darkest corners of a scientific field, or the elite tactical operator. Interestingly, because Scorpio understands hidden pain, this quarter is highly sympathetic to the underdog.
Really?
Yes, they will fight viciously for those who cannot fight for themselves, but they do it with a very aggressive, uncompromising attitude. They are a protector, but a terrifying one.
We have just mapped out a deeply complex psychological terrain. We have a mind built on intense internal friction, demanding heavy, perfect rhythm, and regulated by rigid, unyielding discipline. If this psychological friction is constantly hammering away at their mind, that stress has to go somewhere.
It does.
In medical astrology, Saturn usually rules the rigid, load-bearing parts of the body. Are these individuals literally carrying that tension in their bones and tissues?
Medical astrology gives us a very clear, literal map of this exact phenomenon. Because Dhanishta is heavily influenced by the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, it governs specific structural and circulatory areas. The physical vulnerabilities for these natives lie in the back, the spinal cord, the anus, the knees, and the ankles.
I am noticing a fascinating, almost poetic literalism in the body here. The knees and the back, those are the primary load-bearing structures of the human skeleton. They take the weight, the pressure, the repetitive, rhythmic impact of walking, running, and simply standing upright against gravity. It's the literal embodiment of that Saturnian heavy load.
Absolutely.
But what about the spinal cord and the ankles? Why those specific areas?
Well, the spinal cord is the central structural highway of the nervous system. The fiery electrical impulses of the nerves represent Mars, but they must be encased and protected by the rigid bone of the spine, which is Saturn.
Ah,
When the psychological tension becomes too great, Saturn clamps down, leading to spinal stiffness or nerve compression. As for the ankles, they are the absolute pivot points of forward momentum. Mars wants to sprint forward and conquer, but the ankles are vulnerable to Saturn's restriction. A sprained or broken ankle is the body's ultimate way of forcing the native to stop, sit down, and wait.
And the anus.
Yeah.
That seems highly specific and quite separate from the
It
skeleton.
is entirely connected to Saturn's rulership over the excretory system. Saturn represents restriction, holding on, and the downward movement of physical waste. When a Dhanishta native is dealing with immense psychological stress, they quite literally hold on to their tension.
Oh, wow. So the inability to release psychological baggage manifests physically as an inability to release physical waste.
Exactly, leading to issues within that specific area of the body. It is the physical manifestation of stubbornness.
That makes profound sense when you explain the mechanics of it. But what about the rhythmic aspect? If their foundational psychology is tied to the musical drum, does that manifest physically as well?
It absolutely does, and quite literally. Because their earthly essence is tied so intimately to rhythm and pulse, Dhanishta natives are highly susceptible to cardiac issues and irregular heartbeats.
Because of the pulse.
Right. The heart is the body's internal drum, is the metronome of life. When the native's psychological timing is thrown off by overwhelming stress, or when they inflate their ego and lose their inner hollowness, the physical timing of the heart can falter.
That is incredible. The internal drum literally loses its beat because the mind is out of sync.
Furthermore, we must remember the drum is fundamentally a hollow instrument, meant to receive strikes and produce sound waves. Because of this hollow receptive nature, these natives frequently suffer from hearing issues, earaches, and eardrum sensitivities.
Oh.
The ear is the bodily manifestation of the hollow space that receives vibration from the outside world.
It is all perfectly connected. The hollow reed of the mind, the drum of the heart, the receiving chamber of the ear, it all requires space. It requires emptiness to function properly. When you fill the ear with fluid, you go deaf. When you fill the heart with stress, it skips. When you fill the mind with ego, the rhythm dies.
Yes. And that brings us back to the ultimate earthly challenge for this nakshatra. It is an agonizing daily tension. On one side, there is the tremendous capability, the sheer Martian drive, and the overwhelming Saturnian desire to accumulate worldly wealth, status, and recognition. They are built from the ground up to conquer the material plane.
But on the other side,
On the exact opposite side, there is the vital spiritual necessity of becoming empty. They must learn the incredibly difficult lesson of becoming a pure, hollow instrument for the universe to play its music through. When they fill themselves with their own ego and their own desires, the music stops, the rhythm breaks, and the internal friction tears them apart.
true wealth, then, is not found in the accumulation of the material world, or in conquering the boardroom, or in holding on to the heavy burdens of the ego. True wealth is found in the courage to remain completely hollow, allowing the rhythm of the cosmos to strike you, trusting that the music you naturally produce will be exactly what the world needs to hear.